Hello, Conrad.
Hello, Melinda. I think there's somebody else there with you.
Oh, this guy? He's always over here.
Hi, Conrad.
It's good to see you, Michael. Nice to
Good
have
to
you
see
with
you
us
too.
today.
What's that?
Good to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you. I
I
appreciate it.
summoned Michael to be with us today because, while I am a huge research nerd and I love to really dig into topics, I am not a Star Wars expert. So I wanted to have here with me a Star Wars expert, at least in terms of like original trilogy and the toys, which is definitely Michael. But he's not the only Star Wars expert, as we will get to. So this week, Conrad, and I realize that my background is not our pretty Dreamland background. So let me just change that really quick. I do know that this week I've been talking to a ton of Star Wars people who know way more about it than me, and possibly you too, Conrad.
I'm sure.
So, because we're talking about sort of this part of Star Wars history that is a little bit off the beaten path, right? Like I couldn't find a ton of already existing like books or, there are a few articles and internet posts about it, but there's nothing definitive out there, which is kind of what makes it an interesting topic. But, Michael and I were talking and it's like, what were all the legal misadventures that happened with toy bootleggers, especially during the original trilogy era? And, what type of anti-pirating strategies did Lucasfilm employ during that time between 77 and 83 to prevent all the knockoff merchandise that we know exists? And then what were some of the most famous collectible Star Wars bootleg toys? So to help us with that, I got in touch with Gus Lopez, who we actually met quite a few years back.
Yeah, we met him in 2014 at the Emerald City Comic-Con in Seattle.
That's
while it was going on.
What a great convention that was, by the way. And he put us in contact with a few people who I will have bits and clips of information from during the show. So there's Trevor Wenzel, who is a Star Wars bootleg collector. He has an awesome collection. And he sent me some great photos that I will be sharing. I spoke with Pete Vilmer, he actually works for Lucasfilm now. I will note that in our conversations with Pete, he was speaking just as a longtime Star Wars collector, not as an official, Lucasfilm employee. So just want to make that clear. But he definitely is a huge fan and knows a ton about all of this. And then he actually also put me in contact with Craig Miller, who has done a ton of work, including on Empire Strikes Back. And I found on his Facebook page, he also worked on Return to Oz, Conrad, which we both love very much. So
Yes.
that's really cool.
Now, the preamble, for everybody listening, not to just jump in and interject, but I want everybody to know who's listening right now. Gus Lopez is the preeminent Star Wars collector, adjacent to Steven Sansweet. They're like neck and neck every year. Gus Lopez is like as far as props, unproduced toys, prototypes that never got made, actual memorabilia, artwork, everything. The guy's been in this game forever. And I'm not gonna give away the surprise. Melinda, Conrad, go ahead.
Well, I also want to point out that in addition to his amazing collection, he started the Star Wars Collectors Archive website back in '94, I think, which was the very first Star Wars collecting website on the internet, like ever, which is amazing. So, yeah, Gus was kind enough to join us today. So welcome to Gus Lopez. Thank you, Gus, so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, so it was great that not only you were willing to speak with us about this, but you were willing to take some time out and be on the show. So we really appreciate that.
That's a fun topic. So happy to get into it.
Yeah, so let's do that. Let's dive in. So obviously everybody knows that the film came out in 1977 on May 25th, and it was released despite lots of different production difficulties. It went over budget, notoriously. That was delayed. And so no one was really expecting it to be this huge hit, and so it had this initial limited run, but then, as we all know, it became Star Wars. So, did you first off, I just wanna ask you guys, did you see the film when it first came out? And did you know about, like, any kind of word on the street of how it was before you saw it, or did you just go in blind if you saw it?
Yeah, I did see it that summer, 77. And I had friends who had told me about it and were, I knew multiple people who had seen it, and it was already a phenomenon, really. And I was at the time I lived in New Jersey, so it was in the sort of New York metropolitan area. So it was one of the first areas that got Star Wars. I remember seeing the TV commercials actually in mid-May 1977. So before the film came out, I already was aware of it because we were
Mm.
one of the few markets that had advertising for it. So I saw it that summer, and so I was aware of it from friends. So you got to see this movie, uh, but really nothing really prepared me until I actually saw it, and it was. And I was, and it's interesting. I was talking to some friends yesterday about this. It's uh, the people, it's one of those things, like, it's really hard to describe for people who weren't there at the time, because what films were like before and after Star Wars, it's just so many films now have just, borrowed from Star Wars, have been influenced by Star Wars, that uh for a kid growing up at that time, it was just this tectonic change for films. And so I just became an instant fan. It wasn't even a genre I was into
Oh, really? Oh,
at
wow,
the
okay.
time. I wasn't into, like, sci-fi action films. It was just like, "Oh my god, the world has changed. This is just an experience that I never had seen before."
Yeah, exactly, and so, I mean, I was 1 when the movie came out, so I didn't get to see it, sadly, but I know that a few years back, I did a vintage Christmas catalog retrospective, and where I looked at, how the production of those amazing Christmas catalogs from all the department stores came out every year and what that process was, and I spoke with a man who worked in that department for JCPenney, and he kinda talked about a lot of the timelines, and I'm bringing that up because toy lines at that time in the late 70s, early 80s really relied heavily on the Christmas season and department store catalogs in particular to sort of market and get the word out to kids and families about what's available, right? Because we didn't have the internet, obviously. So the development timeline that was required to create those things, that they had to be complete in like mid-August. So work started on them in March, and the books hit department stores in about mid-September. So that pretty much knocks Star Wars in 77 out of the running to do that, other than, what they actually did, which was they did some really simple things the first year, right, Gus? Like they
Yeah. Yeah, so, for a bunch of reasons, yes, so you're absolutely right. And in fact, to some degree, to this day, they still operate on, and toys being a big thing for a holiday season, and they still haven't really changed the long production cycle. Like, the
right.
advertise it at Toy Fair. I mean, they don't do the catalogs and the retailer catalogs like they used to, but they still sort of are on that same cycle. But the added thing is that film before Star Wars was a terrible bet for toy manufacturers, because, kids would go see a film. It would be popular maybe for a month if it was successful, and that would be it. And so and then a lot of big blockbuster films, if successful, would be like a summer blockbuster. So by the time, you're in November, December, forget it, the kids weren't into the film. So films were generally a very bad bet. So they just weren't investing in film toys. So that was one of the problems. Another problem was that they weren't ready that first season, as you said. So what they did do was, because they were, you know, figured out very late that, oh my God, Star Wars is so popular, we need to get something out there. You notice the stuff they did release was printed stuff, so things that they could do very quickly. Like, yeah, really, like the board game, puzzles, the paint sets. And Kenner had done other paint sets that looked like they just sort of repurposed they had the manufacturing down for it, so they just sort of repurposed it with different imagery. And then the really famous thing they did that first season was the early bird certificate package, which was their way. They weren't ready with the action figures in 77, and so they were definitely realized that they want to do action figures, and they figured out the scale they wanted to do, because they wanted them to work with play sets and vehicles. and they really made this really revolutionary 3 3/4 inch scale, that would work for that. But since they weren't ready, they basically sold kids a slab of cardboard for the first holiday season and said, "Here you go. You're going to get this cardboard playset." And so I actually bought one of these that holiday season because I was
You
really
did?
excited for the action. I did, yeah. I was when I saw it. I think in November at a local toy store, and I was like very excited because I really wanted the action figures. And so I bought my early bird set and sent off for the figures. Um,
Nice.
but yeah, it was. I don't know. It's funny when the story is told about it. Some talk about it as a failure, some as a success. Uh, I was excited actually with the early bird thing because it was just the anticipate. Like it didn't bother me they weren't ready with the action figures. I mean, I certainly wanted them sooner, but I was so excited about it and that they were going to do them and that they had something tangible that we could have as we're waiting for it. So I actually didn't bother me, but it was an interesting idea.
Yeah.
And you look back at a lot of like kind of cheesy things they did for Star Wars in those early days. A lot of it was they weren't ready and they needed to keep it in, in people's attention. And I actually think in many ways it was actually kind of a smart idea rather than
Mhm.
sort of like doing nothing with action figures and then in March 78 saying, "Hey, you know what? We got action figures now." Like it actually created an anticipation. So anyway, I loved it. But anyway, this is all they were able to do in 1977 for action
Well,
figures.
this is all they were able to do, but,
Yeah. Yeah.
other people certainly found a way to do all kinds of things, which is what
Oh
we're
yeah.
about to get into.
Yeah.
I will point out that, when I asked Pete and Trevor about this, Pete says that, early interviews suggested that Lucas used to daydream about a Wookiee mug since what mugs based on dogs were popular at the time. I've always heard this about Lucas loving the whole dog thing, and so it would have been really funny had they opted to add on, like, a Chewbacca mug or, like he mentions, the R2-D2 cookie jars as
Yeah.
an option, which would have been a faster thing to create too,
Well,
probably.
they did eventually have a Chewbacca mug and an R2D2 cookie jar. I have the cookie jar. I don't have the mug. So
Yeah, there was a sculptor, Jim Rumpf, who was actually famous for he did a lot of like pop culture mugs, um, like King Kong and he did like Nixon, like Richard Nixon. He did like a kind of 70s pop culture stuff. He also did bongs, so he did a lot of the sort of head shop kind of stuff. So he was famous for
Nice.
selling stuff in head shops. So anyway, this guy was in LA area, and he's the guy who sculpted the Chewbacca mug, Darth Vader, and
Uh-huh.
Obi-Wan mugs. And he had a company called Mind Circus that did those mugs. And he produced several the mugs that then got sold, that they're really early. They were a very early product, like 77, 7. I think it may have been as early as 77, but 78. They were eventually sold by California Originals, but the very, very early versions of them were sold by Mind Circus, his company, and then they were distributed by California Originals, who then they changed it a little bit for California Originals. Well, anyway, yeah, Jim Rumpf, his stuff is amazing, and there are people that collect his stuff, and the story is that Lucas loved the Chewbacca mug that he made. It's this beautiful sculpt of the Chewbacca mug, and I'm really into some of the earliest collectibles, Star Wars, and from the just really shortly after the film, and over the years I did connect with various people who had very different archives of his stuff. And I have things like, for example, he would write to actors and directors who, like, he wrote to Mark Hamill
Mhm.
and Anthony Daniels, who played C-3PO, Peter Mayhew, who played Chewbacca, Alec Guinness, who played Obi-Wan Kenobi, and sent them samples, and then they wrote letters back to him. And so I have the letters that and photos that they sent back to him. I have a letter from Alec Guinness thanking him for the Obi-Wan mug. And I also have the sculpt of the Obi-Wan mug that he did. So anyway, I got all these really cool things, including the sculpt I got from his niece, who, so, sadly, this guy, Jim Rumpf, tragically died in the early 90s. He got,
Wow.
it was like walking across the street and got hit by a car. But there are a lot of people that really, there's this cult sort of following of his stuff. But if you look up his stuff, it's really interesting style, and you see that style sort of carry over into the Star Wars stuff that he made. But it was kind of cool stuff. But Lucas apparently loved a lot of the things he made.
That's really great. Um Yeah, so I wanted to get into what some of the earliest bootlegs were, and pretty much everyone that I spoke with mentioned these um, little metal miniatures that are sort of like RPG, like D&D type miniatures, and I'll put them up on the screen. Just this is an example of an ad that was in the back of I think Starlog magazine.
Yeah.
Conrad, didn't you say you found this one? And then, from your website, Gus,
Yeah.
these are some close-ups of what they look like. So I think I don't know how common they were to be out in the world, but it seems like everybody knows about them now.
Yeah, they were really used to see these a lot in the 90s. Like, it's kind of interesting. These were like one thing I would say about Star Wars bootleg collecting broadly is it's interesting in other collecting genres. There are people that dabble in bootlegs and people like bootlegs, but Star Wars, it's huge. People are really into bootlegs in Star Wars. It's amazing. Some of the stuff commands like really high prices and a lot of demand. So these were um, I noticed a lot of people really into these, especially in the 90s when they were starting into bootlegs, and used to see these a lot more than I haven't seen them as much in recent years as I used to see them, but which is probably true about a lot of the bootlegs. Uh, and for a while, people were very confused about them. They weren't sure if these were licensed, and there was a while where people were thinking, were these like some Canadian thing or something like that? There was these theories, but yeah, they were a very early bootleg. What was kind of cool was they did a bantha, which a lot of people loved. Like they did characters that really weren't represented in any other form, like with action figures or anything else. Um, they probably aren't as popular among collectors because they weren't usually like things like the action figure stuff is really a huge hit with the collectors.
Mhm.
But yeah, these were these have been around. I don't, you know, I have a couple of them in my collection I picked up years ago. I haven't seen a lot of them trade hands in recent years, but these were quite a bit ubiquitous for a while. When I was sort of really getting heavy into collecting in the 90s.
So I guess I'm just wondering, like, one of the notes that we'll be getting to a little bit later, but it stands out in my mind is that, because there hadn't been a ton of licensed uh, product that was out there from successfully from films and things like that before Star Wars, I think a lot of the people like who were making some of these really early bootlegs didn't see it as any kind of IP impingement or crime or anything like that. They thought it was just fair use, like it was out something you could make in the marketplace. And I don't. I know that now people look at bootlegs as like, oh, bootlegs, like kind of like when people bootleg movies and things. But I don't know that that was the case here, and it makes me wonder if the folks who are making this are just like, well, these would be cool. Like that's the impression I get.
I do wonder, yeah, like when I play back, like, from that at that time, I think that I think in general, enforcement of IP violation, like copyright violations, weren't it wasn't done as effectively as it is done today. Like if you look at like you look at things for other pop culture things during that time, I think bootlegging was more common even in the United States back then than today. It's really hard in a lot of Western countries to see bootlegs because it just gets policed so much better. I think in general that was true, and I think people just took creative license with it. But I think there's also something to Star Wars being new, and they're pushing the boundaries of what what is protected, what's not protected, because Star Wars is new, and that's particularly true, I think, with things like the lightsabers, right? I think when they
Yes.
that's why I think some of those early, because the lightsabers were one of the earliest things that people really put, they actually beat Kenner to, I'm sure we'll get into it, like beat Kenner to market with lightsaber toys. And the thing is that Lucasfilm and Kenner applied for patents and protection on lightsabers. But
Mm.
I think a lot of these other people didn't realize this and thought, well, hey, it's just this blade on a handle. Like I can sell a product like that. I should be. So I think they were much more uh, you know, emboldened on stuff like that. This is really The character stuff is really pushing it, because I mean, you look at like
I
the
think so,
R2D2 and
yeah.
Chewbacca, and you're like, come on. I mean, that's a
And the
pretty blatant,
Stormtrooper too.
yeah,
Yeah, it's
pretty blatant rip off,
it's
you
a
know.
lot.
Yeah,
Some of them are just little alien guys, and it's like, well, you could kind of
yeah,
get away with that, like, in some of these cases that we'll be seeing, like this one, this is a
sure,
Star World.
yeah,
I don't You could kind of argue that the little gold guy looks like C-3PO, and the Wookiee-ish sort of Planet of the Apes combo guy there. I
yeah.
mean, they're sort of the same, and obviously they're trying to be adjacent to Star
I mean,
Wars,
there's
but
obviously an R2, a Vader, a
yeah,
C-3PO, and a
yeah,
Chewbacca there. I mean, Star World is a classic though. Like, so many people who grew up with the funny thing about the Star World case is it was advertised alongside the Kenner action figures. Like, you would see in like the Sears
yeah,
catalog, like
I know.
the Star
It's
Wars
so
action figures and a Star World case. Like they were,
yeah.
even the retailers weren't shy about throwing the Star World case up.
Yeah, I collect those Christmas catalogs, and so I've seen them, like, on the same page, especially in those early, like, 78, 79, those early years, you'll see, like, they'll have all the Star Wars toys that are out, and then right next to it, they'll have some sort of knockoff, like, cheapo brand that's just, like, a couple bucks cheaper. Yeah, it's hilarious.
There's also another one called like Space Case that's similar. Star World is
Uh,
probably the more famous one. There's another one called Space Case, but these are awesome. I mean, I have one of these. I mean, this is it's just like it's also a very early, yeah, very early bootleg that was, and you can see that they're trying to just ride the edge of what, like, trying, like, they're aware of they might get sued. You know, they're using the font. I mean, they probably could get sued on the font of Star Wars. I mean, that
yeah.
logo is, especially the star part, is just a blatant ripoff. The characters, they can probably skirt it, but you know, it's obviously trying to rip off Star Wars. So,
I do like how Darth Vader's a lady,
yeah, yeah,
which is great. I'd like to see that movie.
yeah,
So let's see, what do we have next? Yeah, so these are another sort of example of like US based. I think these came out of New York. Um, Space War line that was just
yep,
again really close, but
yeah,
you got some sort of plausible deniability. But I
yeah.
mean, when you
Creating
put
their
them
own
all
characters,
together,
same style. Yeah, yeah,
it's pretty suspect. But you mentioned lightsabers a minute
yeah,
ago, and they seem to be sort of like one of the really popular early things that kids, I think back in the 70s and 80s, kids loved to play physically out in the
Mhm.
yard because we all
yeah,
went outside and played in the yard
yeah,
with, toys. So like you get these
yeah,
things like the Star Force lightsaber.
yeah,
I found this article on your website, Gus, that talks
yeah.
about how this was kind of made by a 12-year-old kid named John Joy.
Yeah, yeah. Ron Salvatore, you got to read the article is excellent for anybody who's really interested in
Yes.
this topic. Ron Salvatore wrote this blog write up that's fabulous. He goes through the history of all the knockoff lightsabers, and it's really great
Yeah.
research. Like the first one, there's a bunch of them, and they actually all most of them beat Kenner to market, which is kind of funny. But the first one was called the Star Force Ray, and it was a 12-year-old kid. His name was John Joyce, and basically his father, I think, was like worked for like a hardware company or something, and they
Mm.
basically figured out that they could take this like ever ready flashlight. Like, I remember this flashlight even before Star Wars. These like red flashlights were like really common, and they figured out like you can
Mhm.
just attach a plastic tube to it and make a lightsaber. You just get this glowing, lightsaber, by just putting plastic on the end of the flashlight. And so he sold this
Brilliant.
thing regionally, and and it, and sort of that was, and I think according to Ron's research, I think that was probably the earliest example. There were the one that I had was a nationally sold product, the Force Beam. Um, that one was really widely sold. Like, and I think Force Beam was out already, yeah, like 1970. I believe that was one of the ones that was, it was competing with like the early bird certificate with Kenner in 77
Mm.
as one of the first products out. But that was available in my area. And Force Beam was very similar. It was using that ever ready, a flashlight. But what they did with Force Beam is they added you see they added sort of these plastic things. So they have this plastic ring where near where the blade is, and then they added
Mhm.
this thing on the bottom so you don't see that there's like a flashlight thing, and then they throw a sticker on it saying the Force Beam, and then they use a Star Wars font on it. They also came in a couple different colors. Um,
Oh,
and these were sold. They were super popular. They were sold into the 80s. I mean, they sold these for years. Like
mhm.
they went quite a while before they really were you know you know ever had any legal threat. And we actually have some documentation on some of that. And then the theory is that there's another one that's very similar to the Force Beam called the Light Beam, and the theory is that that is probably rebranded Force Beam because they probably were worried about legal issues. Because I'm fairly convinced the Light Beam and the Force Beam are the same manufacturer because they look very similar. Uh, I don't know if anyone's ever determined they are exactly the same, but the Force Beam and the Light Beam are very the most common ones. Then there's a whole host of other lightsaber knockoffs at the time, but they were like widely available, and they beat Kenner to market. And what's really interesting also is when Kenner did come to market, theirs was awful. Like their
Mhm.
first the first
He was telling me this earlier.
is this inflatable lightsaber. So these were plastic. They weren't really that dangerous for kids. I mean, they could knock things off a shelf or whatever, but you weren't going to hurt a
Right.
kid really badly. And it was the 70s. Like there was much crazier stuff going on with kids at the
Sure.
time. Anyway, and so Kenner comes out with this inflatable lightsaber, this sort of limp lightsaber that like there's no way you could hurt a kid with this thing. But it was just not fun, you know. And it wasn't until The Empire Strikes Back that Kenner came out, finally realized like we need to make a plastic lightsaber, and
Gotta go get it.
they didn't really come out with like a good lightsaber till like 1980. So it's kind of funny that that these bootleggers actually did a much better job than Kenner did in the early days. But yeah, there were a lot of companies making lightsabers, and they felt that they could just do free reign on lightsaber, but there were patents and IP protection. Yeah, and there you go with the Force lightsaber, which is
Yeah, and
what
the thing that you're saying, Gus, is so true because I was later than you into the Star Wars thing because I was born a few years later. So I went in the tail end of Empire, and I got this at a Toys R Us or Lionel Toy World. Anyway, point is, then I went and got the later rebranded. It was, they called it at Circus World Sword of Power or whatever, but it was an ever-ready black flashlight with a special white tube on the end, and it lit up. I got that like 6 months later. It was so much more fun than this thing. Like
Yeah,
it was.
Because the light is what makes it cool, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah, and that's the thing. Even when Kenner did the rigid one, it doesn't even have a light. It was just that one. You whirl it, it makes some noise based on the echo from the tube, but it does no light. Like it has no light up effect. Whereas all these other ones used a flashlight, and so you get this really cool like light up effect, and you get different colors. And they did Takara in Japan did do a light up uh, lightsaber in Japan that had different color discs, and the Japanese, of course, innovated and had a really cool lightsaber that we
was
didn't
that
have.
the
But
thing that was called Stick Bang?
uh, I don't think no, it's not that. This was an officially licensed lightsaber. In the 70s, they had a really good lightsaber, and there's probably I have one, and there's a photo on the archive of it. But basically, there's a cool Star Wars lightsaber. There was one available, it's just not anywhere outside Japan, but that was a
Right.
licensed lightsaber. But they probably trusted Japanese kids to properly play with like a good lightsaber.
Sure.
But but uh but anyway, yeah, it was kind of funny. But the bootleggers did a much better job generally. But there's a whole bunch of other ones: the Star Beam, the Space Sword, the Laser
Yeah, I couldn't
Sword.
get them all.
There, there's a
That
whole
article's
bunch.
amazing, though.
Yeah,
You
yeah. Ron did an awesome job on really digging into the history of those bootleg
And the
lightsabers.
photos. Oh my god, my favorite part of it is, let me just put this back on the screen again. So this middle photo that shows the little kid, there's a bunch of ones like that have these kids in various, like, some of them they're very cool, some of them they're really dorky, and it's just probably the funniest part of all of it to me is when I'm reading that article, just seeing those photos. I don't know how he managed to find them all, but just
Yeah, there's
perfection.
some great ones where the kids are in costume, and then they have like kids in poses like Luke and
Yeah,
Leia, and they're really
it's
funny.
amazing.
Just yeah.
Yeah. Conrad, I have to ask you, since this is using this very well-known light flashlight, did you guys have this type of thing in England that you remember? Like, did you have this flashlight? Does this look familiar at all?
No, not at all. And I never had a lightsaber as a kid. So I'm not sure if it made it to these shores. Maybe we missed it completely.
Wow.
And I can tell you all that when I finally got my knockoff lightsaber at Circus World, it was clear that they had tried to run a little farther away from Lucasfilm's attorneys because it came with a card flap over almost like it, because it didn't come in a box. It came in a card flap in a upended box, and the card flap, I'll never forget. It had a He-Man looking guy on it drawn, who was pointing the energy sword at the like force perspective, and it had a green glow, but he was like this shirtless buff dude, and they called it the Sword of Power or something like that. It was a lightsaber. I mean, yeah.
A couple people are pointing out that in England they're called torch sabers.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. So like,
joke, or if it's true.
because flashlights are called torches there. That would make sense.
Yes, we had those in the UK. So yeah, it would be interesting to see like what kinds of things were created over there. But I do love the fact that this first one that you were talking about, they have the sticker, like you mentioned, that just goes over like, this isn't an ever ready flashlight. This is a stack all.
Which is pretty telling, because that's what they did sometimes in the actual movies to cover the Graflex.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that's right. It's probably like an unwittingly a nod to what they did in the movie. Yeah.
Tried and true.
Yeah.
So there's this great letter that I also found. Really quickly. I want to show you this. So this is cool because it's like, I think it's in that same article, and it talks about what we're talking about, which is the bootleggers sort of like competing in that Christmas time period in 77, because they just couldn't get like a lot of really intricate toys made. So this was a really cool article that was posted there, which I really love. So again, check out that article if you get a chance. And then this was also mentioned. So Gus, tell us about the backstory on this thing.
Yeah, so this is a cool piece. So this is a rare example of where we have documentation of the internals of what's going on with like licensee and Lucasfilm on early bootlegs. And it's what it is a letter from Kenner's legal department to Lucasfilm's legal department to say, hey, here's a sample of a bootleg lightsaber being sold, the light beam, which I mentioned earlier, which I believe is the evolution of the force beam, which was the early one. What I find, there are a few things I found very interesting about it. One is that it took them 5 years to write a letter. I mean, it says 1982, right? So it's like they've been selling these things for 5 years at this point. It's like, I had the Force Beam when it first came out, which I think was 77. Like, I was already had one for 5 years as a kid. But that they I have this letter, and then there's this poster tube that contained a Force Beam that inside it, and I have that too, that was sent to Lucasfilm, basically sending the sample to Lucasfilm and saying, hey, you guys need to investigate this and go after this company, because Kenner's a licensee, but they're not really in the position. They need Lucasfilm to be, suing the company or sending cease and desist orders to the company to stop it. So it's an example of in the early days of some documentation on this, because we find a lot of the history of how they went after this, is limited, and we don't really have a lot of evidence of many cases where they really went after bootleggers, and it's not very clear what Lucasfilm did with it, if they did even go after the company. I presume they did, because this was very concrete and this was a formal legal letter. But it's kind of a cool piece of the history, and so it's something I have in my collection.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you hear sort of anecdotally, like what I see when I was doing this research was people would get cease and desist things. And I mean, presumably a lot of them did cease and desist, and then it just kind of went away. I'm sure some people didn't, and there may have been actual court cases, but there's not a ton of, that I found anyway, documentation on it.
One of the really cool things that you found, though, Melinda, which I really enjoyed pouring through, was the Facebook page set up by Charles Lippincott. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That's right.
But yeah, so Charles Lippincott was part of Lucasfilm right from the very beginning as a marketing, publicity, advertising guy, and he's saved an awful lot. And it's still, I mean, he's no longer with us, but on his Facebook page, you can still search through and find all of these cease and desist letters that he's found in his archives. So you can see some of the effort that they went to try to get people to cease and desist. But even he could say that, you know, his heart wasn't really in it. He didn't feel that it was going to be terribly effective, and you know, it's kind of like whack-a-mole at one point, I guess.
Yeah, if you and I will second that. Like the Charles Lippincott's, like what he posted online on Facebook, and his wife still maintains still goes through his archives and posts some great stuff from those days. And so if you get a chance to check it out, it's really amazing information. And he was really one of, I mean, the key people that made Star Wars a success, particularly the marketing of Star Wars and the merchandising of Star Wars. Like he secured all these deals with these licensees. I mean, he was a key person in that, and he was also involved in some of those early legal things. And so there's just this wealth of information that he shared online, and that is still there, and that his wife continues to find, like, documentation that she shares. So it's great stuff if you get a chance to check it out. And there were examples that he had shared about early, you know, bootleggers that they went after.
For sure. I think one of the things that you and I spoke about briefly in one of our calls before the show was about, you know, bootlegs that were sort of popping up in other countries. And I know we think of bootlegs as being something people are doing to be opportunistic and sort of prey upon existing IPs. But a lot of times in some of like these Eastern European countries and even South America, there wasn't really a pathway to like above board market these things. And then even when they came out, there was no way to really seek them out and do anything legally just because of the complexities of international law and all this kind of stuff. So you see like some really specific types of examples of these in these other countries. And I just kind of wanted to run through them. I know a lot of people who know about this already kind of are aware of them, but they're so cool. And as we start talking a little more about them, it'll be helpful to kind of sort of set the stage of what these things look like. So
yeah.
I'll
one thing I will
off,
say, just
yeah,
before you jump in there, one thing I'll say is, so just for the background, like Kenner had the worldwide license to Star Wars toys, but one of the things that those days you didn't have sort of global toy companies. So what they did is they did deals with national toy companies in each of these countries, like Palitoy in the UK, Meccano in France, and Harbert in Italy, PBP in Spain, Takara in Japan, where they worked with these toy companies to distribute the action figures
right.
in localized packaging. But there were, as you'll, when you go through these, you'll see there's a bunch of countries that just, they're either behind the Iron Curtain, or they never got an official release of Star Wars or whatever, that didn't have a toy manufacturer in that country. And that's where that was just ripe for bootlegs. And so that's sort of the backdrop of it. And those tended to be the countries that got a lot of these bootlegs.
And they are probably one of my all-time favorite things. Like these, I love them. They just fill me with delight. So these are probably the ones that everyone focuses on the most. I think it's either it's Uzi or Uzai. I'm not sure because I don't speak Turkish, but this is from, it's Joseph's article on your website. And I guess these are from his collection as well, right?
Yeah, Joe Iglesias has this amazing bootleg. He's an authority on bootlegs, like probably the number one authority on bootlegs for Star Wars. And so, you know, I am not the expert on bootlegs, like he is the guy on bootlegs, but
right.
he has a great collection of these, and a full collection of the Uzi bootlegs. But these are some of the best ones. So the Imperial Gunner is awesome because they took this like calculator, like you can see the Casio calculator that they used.
Yeah, Trevor sent me a picture. I guess this is maybe from his collection that he has.
Okay, Trevor, yeah, and you can tell, like, it's one of the things I appreciate about Star Wars collectors is how extreme they are. Like, you don't really see it in other collecting, that they actually track down the Casio calculator on the Uzi bootleg of the Imperial Gunner. Like, you just don't see that in other collecting genres, right? Like, that kind of like fanaticism is awesome, you know. But it's like the calculator that's why the Imperial Gunner is one of the favorites. and then they invented, they did a bunch of the standard characters, but they also invented characters like Headman, where they took like a royal guard and they took his cloak off and gave him a shield and a sword. I mean, the thing is completely awesome. It looks like this sort of medieval, like,
It does.
soldier guy.
He looks
There's
like a
also
guillotine guy. He looks like the guy who'd chop your head off.
yeah, it's just so awesome. And then there's another one they invented that it's called Blue Stars, which is also a popular one, which is yes, yeah.
No, they're in here. They're in here.
He's in there, yeah. The Blue Stars basically is a snow trooper just painted blue, and so they in addition to sort of standard Star Wars characters, so they have like C-3PO, and they have like Royal Guard and a few. Yeah, there you go. There's Blue Stars. Blue Stars is just this character they just invented for the line, which is just also, so people love particularly Blue Stars and Headman, because they're just these cheesy sort of made up characters that are derivative of Star Wars characters.
Yeah, Trevor was pointing out the slight different variations because, again, as you were pointing out, we all know Star Wars fans are like for real. And so just all of these tiny little differences. Oh, well, I have the one that's got the green on the top and the red on the, oh, well, I have the one that's got the green on the bottom. Like, so it's amazing.
And you can imagine, right? Like even like a real toy manufacturer is going to have variations, but like a bootlegger, you got to think like the quality control is all over the place, probably.
Oh my God. Yeah. Everyone is different, kind of. Like some of them, he was saying, some of them are actually just one-offs. Like there may only be one or two that are like that. So that's really cool. And I know, let's see, what else was I going to say about these guys? I think this is from, I didn't get a chance to copy paste, but this is also from Trevor's collection. So he's got a ton of these.
That's a great set,
even the mini rigs, that you can see down there that they made to go with them.
Yeah, they have a couple mini. I have one of those in my collection. They're. I mean, you can see like the extent. I mean, they basically took the Kenner action figures, they molded off of them but they made separate like steel molds, and they properly made action figures, but I think these are probably the number one thing among bootleg collectors, because they're comical, but they're done in the style of Return of the Jedi cards. They're beautiful packaged. These are a hit. People love these things. And then of course they got the weird characters and photos.
I love that it says Stars War at the top. And I also love apparently like the thing about these is just the artwork on the cards. So I assume that carded is way more valuable than loose for these guys. Because the artwork is just crazy. Like it's amazing.
I don't know if, also, I don't know if these were meant to be sold with Turkish Star Wars. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of Turkish Star Wars.
Yeah.
But I don't think they were meant to go with it. But like Turkish Star Wars, for people who don't know, is like they basically took clips from Star Wars and then shot footage in Cappadocia and Turkey. Best seen with like Star Wars fans in a small group with lots of alcohol, and then you really enjoy the Turkish Star Wars. But anyway,
for sure, sounds like a great time. So moving to Hungary, and that word, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that because I don't speak Hungarian, but that just means Star Wars in Hungarian. This is sort of examples of those, and I did a close-up. I know it's really grainy, but that face up there of Luke is nightmare fuel. Like and then you got like a pig-faced looking Yoda guy. But he's got a cloth cape. Like that's cool. Like very
they went to some detail. It's interesting because you see obviously the paint stuff is low quality, but like the accessories and stuff, you can see they actually in some ways like are trying to do a proper toy manufacturer, and these are wonderful because they have a lot of different color variations on the cards. So the Hungarian stuff, like people are trying to chase down, they're very sort of colorful displayed as carded. But like it's fascinating to me with Hungary is sort of the first example of these were people remember at the time. I mean this was during the Cold War. And Hungary was one of the more sort of liberated, best word to use, bit of the countries behind the Iron Curtain, but like they weren't really getting a lot of these countries weren't getting official releases of Star Wars. So I don't know if Hungary may have, because they were a bit more connected to Western European countries. But it's fascinating that, I don't think, but I think a lot of American companies weren't selling products in Hungary at the time, and so it just was natural for bootlegs. And so that's why a number of the countries like, Hungary and Poland and Russia got bootlegs, because you didn't have Western countries selling products at the time behind the Iron Curtain.
Well, plus over here, you certainly didn't get like a Rocky style Yoda that's got boxing gloves on. What, were you going to say something?
No. I was just pointing out this. I was just reiterating what Gus said. Yeah, in the absence of an official channel to get real merchandise, people innovate, and this is what happens.
Yeah.
Which I think is awesome. And these are some more. These are Poland original bootlegs. These are from the early 80s. And aside from Han on the left, who looks really rough, like he looks like zombie Han, honestly. But I think the Princess Leia is actually quite admirable. Like, she looks pretty good. And I mean, I don't understand the wide leg stance. Are they gonna like ride horses or?
Yeah, I was gonna say they've been riding too long.
Yeah, I think on these they made molds. They're obviously based on the Kenner figures. I have one of the steel molds for like the Hoth Rebel Trooper. And I think what they did is they took the Kenner action figures from the first couple films, and they made molds out of that from the Kenner figures, and then so they've lost a lot of the detail in the molding process. And then they, I don't know what's going on with the legs, but anyway,
they're interesting.
You can tell that the Polish ones were derivative of the Kenner ones, like that they're even like, you look at the shape of Han's arm and I mean, if you're very familiar with the Kenner figures, you see a lot of but it's a lot of the details are still there, but it's sort of, you can see it's derivative of it. So anyway, to me, I think what's happened is that they've molded from the Kenner figures, but then they've, they have new pins and stuff in the toys, so that's why you get the legs spread apart and all that kind of stuff. And but yeah, it's like they're doing whatever they can to try to get the product out in Poland.
Yeah, and these are some slightly later versions, so not quite as crazy with the leg spread, but the cards are interesting.
Yeah.
This is the power of the Force range, isn't
it? Yeah. Clearly, the merchandisers in Poland had great admiration for the Y-wing, and I have to respect them for that. So I love the Y-wing.
That's cool. Yeah. But I think one of my favorite, I would say my favorite that's coming from Europe is this next one, which is from the Netherlands. And that is just the coolest thing I've ever seen, because it is like something, it looks like a Bigfoot much more than anything else. And then I like the little rubbery, chubby Darth Vaders. Yeah. The middle one there in the image is a regular Kenner Darth Vader. So you can see the little 3-inch and then the 5-inch ones. And apparently they were sold not in packaging, but like hanging off of a string. That's why they have the little thing on the top of their head to hang them from. I just think these things are creepy and amazing.
Yeah, they're totally. And that's what the fun thing I think in bootleg collecting is the sort of quirkier, cheesier are more fun, right? Like a lot of bootleg could go for. The weirder they are, the more fun they are. And this also shows you, this is an example, this is the Netherlands that had official toys too. And so some of the countries like Netherlands or Mexico or Brazil actually had licensees, like, they actually sold the official products, but sometimes the official licensees didn't fill, every niche that kids wanted. And the bootleggers figured out other products to sell there, or they might've hit lower price points or something. And so they found a niche for kids.
And then my favorite one that I wish I owned some of, but they're probably way too expensive for me to buy, right, dear, is Model Trem, which is, I love these because, as everyone who has heard me talk about it knows, I love metal toys. So these are like, I guess they took the original Kenner molds and made them out of metal, right? Like, yes, they're so cool. Some of them, like the second guy there, is just amazingly detailed. I love it.
Yeah, and these are sold in Brazil, and they're I think they're made of lead, so they're like heavy and poisonous.
Heavy and poisonous.
So it's like the perfect kid's toy, like this
Yeah.
heavy metal thing that's going to poison your brother when you throw it at him.
Because kids don't chew on their toys ever.
Yeah, no.
I know. I'm just thinking about the amount of time I used to put Star Wars figures in my mouth. This is not good.
And they also, but one of the coolest things about Model Tram are the boxes. They came in these really cool cardboard boxes with the you can sort of see the labels on them and so on. So just a very unique style of packaging. And what's cool is they also had this like very like you've probably seen that like 60s space font, they used that on it, which is kind of fun. And they also did Model Tram also had I believe had some made up characters too, similar to the Turkish figures. They did like here you have Bossk and Rees and Han Hoth and stuff, but they also had like weird characters they made up. And so it's kind of that's a really fun bootleg line.
Yeah, it really is. And then I had like some stuff that I saw from Japan that was crazy, but I didn't know if I could show the photos because I couldn't get in touch with the folks who own the photos. But I did get this thing, which is really cool, which are these Japanese model kits that the artwork alone is just amazing. Like I absolutely love it.
And you see, this is like a thing in Japan too, where people make their own model kits. Like it's like I don't know, probably not describing it well, but it's like there's a whole like sort of culture around custom model kits. Like there's hobbyists that do this all the time. And and back in the day, people did Star Wars ones, like bootleg ones. I especially love the Tusken Raider one. It looks like
I know, me too.
These are awesome. But yeah, there's a bunch of bootleg Japanese ones, and I think they call them garage kits. I think is what they call them.
Garage kits.
Yeah. And so, but yeah, these are wonderful.
Yeah, and I love the fact that one of the Cantina band members is getting primo exposure in this line.
That's
right. Why him? We don't know, but he just looks fun.
He's the tough guy in the band.
He must be the drummer. Anyway,
he didn't get paid by the club owner.
That's right.
That night. Yeah.
So with all of that sort of as a backdrop, I think so. We had some questions, and we'll just kind of run through some of them. So the first one was, did Lucas always realize the value of merchandising and toys, or was this something that became obvious after the first film was so popular?
I'd say yes and no. Like I think he, on one hand, he was an incredible visionary in that he negotiated the rights to the merchandise, and the studio completely underestimated that. Like I don't basically when he was negotiating with 20th Century Fox over like what he would own and what they would own, he got 100% of the merchandising rights, and they got 0. And they must have just viewed it as worthless, because for films at the time it was worthless. It was like there's nothing in that. And he knew, and as we spoke earlier, like he had particular products he had in mind that he really wanted to do, and he really felt Star Wars really lent itself to do products. So he had the foresight to negotiate for that. And it was obviously brilliant. I mean, Star Wars has made more money from products than from film.
Yeah.
So it was like, it was genius to do that. Now, I think like everybody else, he was taken by surprise. He didn't think Star Wars was going to be a hit. So the extent to which it became successful, I think, took him by surprise, like it took everyone by surprise. But but he was definitely a visionary when it came to that. Now, and he was also, I mean, he was a comic book fan, so he was aware of a lot of sort of at least comic book collecting, is aware of that. And he was influential in things like we spoke before about the mugs and the cookie jars and the toys. He had ideas about that. So yeah, I think he really was ahead of his time, and that served him well. He benefited a lot from
I'll say. Yeah. I think the biggest question is sort of what was the initial Lucasfilm response to bootlegs? Because I don't know if we've sort of talked about it a little bit, but I don't know if they were completely aware of all of it initially. Like it was like 4 or 5 years down the line before they were finding out about some of these lightsaber things that were pretty out there in magazines and everything else.
Right. Like and this is where, I think get into you know, you have to piece it together from sources, like, and a bit of speculation. Like, you know, someone like Charles Lippincott, who's not around anymore, you know, would have been the person that would probably know the best. But Craig Miller, who I think you spoke to,
Yep.
was aware of probably some of what was going on at the time. I think from what I've gathered from the information is that they did go out when they learned about something, they did go after it. As we saw from the example of the lightsaber, it took several years for them to respond and to be aware. You know, at the time, I remember as a kid, you know, subscribed to magazines and fanzines, you'd see advertisements of all sorts of stuff that was being sold, bootleg stuff. And it was probably a lot of it was going under the radar. But at the
Mhm.
same time, like Lippincott was really, one of the things he did that was really genius was he was very uh, integrated with the fan community. He was going to conventions. They were connecting to things like Starlog magazine and all these places where he realized that if you get the diehard fans connected to these films, you can, you know, you will be successful. And so they must have been seeing the ads of all these bootleg products that were being sold in all these magazines. So they must have been aware. The extent to which they went after them, I don't know. Like in the early days, like you know, Lucasfilm and the Star Wars Corporation, all those folks, it wasn't a huge company. They didn't have like a
Mhm.
whole army of lawyers. It isn't like sort of today, you know, and even Disney, Lucasfilm, but pre-Disney, it wasn't a massive company. They, I'm sure they picked their
Yeah.
battles when they went after, you know, copyright violations.
Right.
But yeah, so I don't. There isn't a lot of the history we actually don't know of how often they went after it. But I know that they were. We do know from the evidence we have that they were aware of it. They did. You know, go after some of these folks to try to shut them down. Obviously, the licensees get very annoyed about it. They're the ones most impacted by it because you know, they've paid money to get the rights to sell a product in a country, and they've got this bootlegger that's displacing
Sure.
some of their sales. So they're the ones really angry about it. And so we know that, you know, Kenner was obviously, uh, you know, reacting to some of this. But I don't know in the early days, but they obviously were juggling a lot of things at the time, right? They were doing new movies. They were rushing to get products out to market. So I don't know the extent to which it was a priority for them. That's a tough thing to assess.
Yeah, I know I spoke with Pete, and he says that he thought that there was a fairly aggressive response to combat illicit merchandise. And he talked about that there had been stories of FBI agents combing science fiction conventions at the time to
Oh, wow.
tamp down on materials, which I thought was really interesting. And he was like, you know, you should talk to Craig Miller because he might be able to tell you about that. And so then just earlier today, I was able to connect with Craig, and he very graciously gave me just a really quick background, and I'm going to read parts of it because it's so interesting. He says,
Yep.
as to illegal and bootleg merchandise, it wasn't like we had a task force seeking it out at conventions or in fandom, and we really didn't want to be nasty to fans who were mostly just celebrating their love of Star Wars. If anything, we wanted to celebrate them. So part of what Craig did at Lucasfilm was to rein in the lawyers at Fox who wanted to send cease and desist letters to everyone who published a fanzine or painted a picture of Luke Skywalker. But they were mostly trying to focus on manufacturing unauthorized Star Wars merchandise in quantity and wholesaling it to stores and dealers. And so he said, as you know, it's a complex situation. Licensees don't like you just said, having paid fees and royalties for exclusive rights to manufacture, and then other people selling knockoffs and cutting into their sales. So he talks about how it's important for companies to maintain if you don't enforce your copyright, you can lose it. So that's the other reason that they have to kind of go after these things.
Yeah, a couple things to respond to that. Like, I think, so yeah, obviously that's a wealth of information, and Craig would have a lot of the perspective of those early days. It's a very interesting story from both Pete and Craig, actually, about sending the FBI agents to conventions and so on. Um, um, uh, I'm not a lawyer, but what I understood talking to IP lawyers is that for copyrights, you don't need to enforce it to keep it, but for trademarks you do. But I could be wrong on that. But it would be a thing to ask an IP attorney just to see.
For
But I
sure.
don't think that.
And
But
I am
anyway,
not an
but
attorney.
anyway, but I think one of the things that Lucasfilm did that was very smart, and that I think that Craig alludes to, that they did in that day, and that Steve Sansweet continued, and others at Lucasfilm continued into the '90s and early 2000s, was the idea that they were very lenient on the fan community, and they embraced fans and said, look, we're going to allow some liberties with fans to do their own things, because it's not really going to step on our toes if fans make some swag and custom things and fanzines. They really weren't concerned about that. They're concerned about people trying to really infringe and hurt their business. And so,
Right.
which is just a very insightful, visionary look at it. Whereas a lot of other companies wouldn't land on that decision, right? They'd go after everybody, and they and the little guy too. And it was like, and it's cool that like Craig spoke to, like that even in those days, they did not want to upset fans and doing fanzines. Like, and it's going to go on anyway, even
Right.
if they policed
For
it, right? So
sure. And they didn't go after the fan films either.
yeah,
Like they
exactly. Yeah. They
yeah.
were cool about it. But if people started selling fan films and promoting them
Right.
as official, then they would go after it, and
Which
so
makes sense, right?
yeah.
Like for all the reasons we said. And to go back to the FBI thing, Craig has this extra little part that I have to share. It's so interesting. He says, I remember at the 1978 World Science Fiction Convention in Phoenix, Arizona, I had a booth for Lucasfilm in the dealer's room. We had a rear screen projection system set up showing lots of artwork from Star Wars, and he had a sample radio-controlled R2 toy from Kenner running around on the table. And it was really just to have a presence at the convention. He says the FBI has a big office in Phoenix. Apparently, a lot of mobsters would retire to there for the warm weather, and they like keeping an eye on them. So they sent some agents of the copyright squad to the convention. And he said, we hadn't asked them to be there. I didn't even know that they would be there until the lead agent was introduced to me. The FBI walked around the room looking for trademark violations, not just Star Wars, but Star Trek and other things like that. So when they found someone who was clearly just a fan and had a few self-made items, they would just tell them to put it under the table until they left, and they didn't do anything to them. But apparently they wanted to send a message to some of the bigger guys who were really doing it, really cutting in on people's stuff. And so they said several agents raided several dealers, confiscating boxes and boxes of bootleg T-shirts, buttons, pens, etc. Much of it produced by a single company out of Florida that was wholesaling it all over the country. So I think that's kind of the level of difference. If it's just one lady who's making like Star Wars crocheted things, they don't care. But if it's like a T-shirt manufacturing place that's shipping them all over the country, that makes total sense that they would go after that.
Yeah, that's great that they were being smart about it and didn't want to upset fans, but they were, and so yeah, I mean, and I think people like Craig really have a lot of that history, and Craig has a couple books that he's done, by the way, of the early. You should definitely get. He's got this wonderful book about his years working on Star Wars, and talks about a lot of the history. So you can if
Yeah,
you get a chance to get his book, it's wonderful. Like, talks about the early days of running that. It was like a small, scrappy team doing this stuff, and it's really fascinating history.
It's so interesting to think of it that way, because we think of, especially now, we think of Star Wars as this big multi-billion-dollar thing, but it wasn't back then.
It wasn't. Yeah, it was not that many people involved in it for such a big worldwide impact.
Sure. Yeah. So, and Trevor had noted too, when he was talking about bootlegs, he says the one bootleg line that I'm aware of that was given a cease and desist was the model trim line that we mentioned earlier from Brazil. And they basically then changed their molds just enough so that they didn't clash anymore. So they still made them, but they just changed them just enough so that they could scoot in.
I'm surprised that worked, because those look pretty blatant.
Well, I think those may be some of the early ones. I certainly don't know, so Trevor can speak to that better, but that's what he told me, which I think is great. Yeah, so I just wondered, like, did Lucasfilm look... I think this was actually your question, Conrad, about looking at Star Trek as an example.
Yeah, I was thinking about that while you were talking, that as well as it, Star Wars not being a giant operation when it started, it really didn't have much to look to in terms of examples of a massive franchise beyond Star Trek. And it's interesting that Charles Lippincott on his Facebook page noted a couple of things about this. He mentioned that B. Joe Trimble, who was such a cornerstone of the Star Trek fandom and a writer as well, had said to him at one point that they need to, quote, rein in their fans right from the beginning, because if they waited, it would be harder to control the fans after they'd taken over the franchise, which it is an interesting take. But Charles Lippincott said that he said, I knew we had to rein in the piracy. The big franchise that had been on the scene prior to Star Wars was Star Trek, and Star Trek hadn't done that. So I was curious what your thoughts would be on that, and whether there was any sense that they looked to Star Trek as an example of how to deal with this.
Yeah. I mean, I think that they, from what I've gathered reading what Charles wrote, like, they did study what other sort of pop culture phenomenon, and they were very in tune with sci-fi fandom and all that, and Star Trek was definitely something they had looked at. I mean, and Star Trek had done, they'd done the Mego Star Wars toys, the action figure line. It came out years after Star Trek was out, so there were things they could look at, that were relevant for Star Wars that they could learn from. And I don't know much about like what he looked at in terms of like their relationship with fandom and controlling it and piracy, but I suspect that they did a lot of, from what I know, reading a lot of what Charles Lippincott did, is that they they did take in a lot of prior history to apply it to Star Wars and how they wanted to govern it. And but like what I gathered reading from his stuff is that they really encouraged fans to they understood, and I think also Lucas understood, there's this deep sort of fan community that if they can tap into it, it will help make the film successful. And you got to think like this is ahead of its time, right? This is before influencers. This is before people really understood how to tap into that kind of marketing where you and in marketing, it's now well understood that if you hit certain people that can connect to these networks, you can make something very popular very fast. And they really understood that for Star Wars in a way, like it was way before their time, and they understood it
Mhm.
particularly for that sort of sci-fi sort of fandom thing, and how to like embrace fandom, not alienate fandom. And I think that was pretty visionary. But I don't know, for everything I've read that Charles Lippincott said, is like they really tried to embrace fans, and they went to conventions. There's all these great stories about how he went with like Mark Hamill, and they would sign the posters, the Chaikin poster, which is this early poster they had, and nobody knew who Mark Hamill was. He's like, I'm going to be in this film, and like nobody knew what it was, and it's just kind of comical when you look back at it, but they realized, like, even a year before the film was out, like that they needed to promote this to those
Mhm.
fans, right? They were all over that. As far as the piracy part of it, I don't know if they were. I don't know how high a priority it was. I'm sure they were aware of it. I don't think, though, any of them anticipated that the merchandise would be as big as it was. And
Right.
they had so many things they were dealing with. Like one of the biggest things they were dealing with was that they were immediately working on a sequel, like right after the film was successful. They were trying to like, I mean, you can imagine, like after Star Wars popularity hit, they were trying to keep Star Wars in the public eye for the next
Sure.
3 years while they were trying to work on a sequel, and they were trying to release all this product. So they had a lot of things going on. They're dealing with all of that
And they
and
were
the
small,
piracy.
like we
Yeah.
said.
And they were small. So I don't know if they had a whole lot of bandwidth to be going after. I mean, but to what Pete said, like, and Craig said, like, if and they would know better than I would. Like if they were going after all the pirates, then I totally believe that was going on too, and it might not have gotten a lot of publicity either, that they were doing that behind the
Yeah,
scenes. Yeah.
I wouldn't imagine so, and I think that's why it might be so hard to find some of this information, but Pete, this is where he did point out that, because of the whole thing with Star Trek and a lot of people were making bootlegs about that, he says a lot of science fiction fandom probably felt bootleg activity was acceptable, and Lucasfilm and Fox made a concerted effort to clarify that they wouldn't tolerate it. But I think these early examples, like the 12-year-old kid, I don't think he and his dad like were thinking, we're gonna get one over on Lucasfilm. Like they just thought, oh, this would be fun to make. Like
Yeah.
I really think it was just that innocent in some of these early, especially these early cases.
Yeah.
So uh one of the next questions was, did toy bootlegs account for a significant proportion of the overall bootlegging activity, or were other types of merchandise more prolific? And I think there were probably a lot of other types, but I don't know. What do you think? What's your
Well,
impression?
what I've read is that in some of it, well, and certainly in those countries that didn't have the official products, bootlegs reigned. I mean, they were they were they
Yeah,
were the dominant product. I've read that actually in '77, the bootlegs in Star Wars probably outsold the official Kenner stuff. Like
that would make sense.
the force beam lightsabers. Um, some of the articles, some of the stuff Ron put together, I think points to that was outselling like the earlier bird certificate and so on. Like I think until Kenner really ramped up the action figure. I mean, once Kenner got going on the action figures, that was the
Yeah,
dominant thing. But I think in '77, bootleg stuff may have outpaced the official. I would pretty confidently say it probably outpaced the official stuff in '77 in the United States. In other countries, it might be different, right? Like in the UK, the film didn't come out till '78, and by then, you know, you have time for the toys to catch up. But so it might have varied country to country. But in the U.S., I would say in the early years, bootlegs may have sold more early on, and then of course there's a bunch of countries where we're only bootlegs, and then there's some countries as we talk to like the Netherlands and there we didn't get into Mexico as a country that's sort of
right,
famous for bootlegs. Like we used to go like I like for years. I mean, even into the 2000s, they had bootlegs in Mexico. Like we would go to conventions in Mexico all the time, and we would always go to the flea markets and buy the bootlegs. And a lot of times, the bootlegs in Mexico were there to address a price point where,
right,
like, the official products really address like middle class, sort of people that can afford the manufactured things, but then you could hit sort of a lower price point for people who couldn't afford the retail products. And so we would find, I mean, we well into the 2000s always find bootleg stuff in Mexico. We'd go, like, if we went to San Diego Comic Con, we'd take the train to Tijuana and go through the
mhm,
flea markets, or we'd go to shows in Mexico City and always hit the flea markets and always found some amazing stuff there. So anyway, in some countries it was to address different segments of the market that the toy
right.
manufacturers really couldn't tap based on their price point.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And in terms of, and I almost pulled out a bunch of the Mexican ones too because there are a ton. I
Yeah.
just am like, well, I can't show every bootleg because goodness
Yeah.
knows there are like bazillions of them. But you're right. Obviously, that's a really cool section as well. Um, I think talking about like favorite bootlegs and
Hmm.
rare bootlegs. So I did ask, I know with Trevor, I asked him that. He said probably the most infamous and valuable are those Uzi Turkish ones. Everybody talks about those, and we kind of already dealt with that. And then he says for rare, that's a loaded question because there are many items that exist in known quantities in collectors' hands of like one or two.
Yeah.
Like they're just very, very, very rare. So for me, that would be very appealing. Like I love the idea of there just being like this one guy that like this one little, like he
Yeah.
talks about, I guess his thing that he loves to collect are does he just focus on Gamorrean guards? He's got this guy.
Yeah.
I think I showed him. And so he has this one and one other one. They each have a different broken leg, but they're like the known examples, the two known examples of this particular paint scheme for this particular guy, this
Yeah.
little Polish guy. So I don't know. I think that that's really interesting. And those blue stars that we showed earlier are also some examples of like really
One of a
unique.
kind variations of the.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have, like, for example, the thing I mentioned, like I have one of the steel molds for one of the Polish action figures. Like that's a one of a kind piece, and some of these, like, variations are they're so rare, and I mean many of them are one of a kind, or there's only a known handful of them, so they get exceptionally rare. I would, I do. And I'm not a specialist like, say, Trevor or Joe, any of these other people we mentioned, Ron, people who specialize in this stuff. But the Turkish Uze stuff is my favorite. Like they are just such awesome action figure, packaging and designs, that those are definitely my favorite bootlegs of the line. But there's so many other ones that we went through that are great. And yeah, I mean, they're just a fun thing to collect. And again, as we talked about, I think they do really illustrate the depth of research. As Star Wars collectors, just always impress me at the level of the. And because I like to dabble and learn about other collecting genres, and because it helps me as a Star Wars collector to say, is there something I can carry over into Star Wars collecting? And when I do that, I do learn a lot of things from other collecting genres. But what I'm always impressed with Star Wars collectors is the depth of knowledge and the intensity, like the way like we have collectors that have gone to like Hungary and Poland and Turkey to go find bootlegs. We went through. I was in. I went with friends in Istanbul in Turkey, and we found a warehouse where they had Turkish figure, not the Uzes, but like more contemporary ones in the early 2000s. And I went in St. Petersburg in Russia, and we found bootleg figures there. And I know other people have done that, like gone to Hungary and Poland and
Amazing.
tracked down the bootleg figures. Like you don't hear that in other collecting genres of people really going out there to really find this stuff. And then research it. It's kind of fun that we have that kind of crazy intensity in Star Wars.
Well, I think it's interesting. Like, I love collecting My Little Pony, and they have similar types of things where they'll have like variants that were made either officially or, unofficially in other countries. And so you'll have these sort of rare, you know, Nirvana ponies is what they're often called, is these sort of one-off odd like European type things. And but the fake ones are not. I think they're starting to grow in value, but they're not nearly as sought after as a lot of these Star Wars ones. And I don't know
Yep.
why that is, if it's just the magic of Star Wars
Yep.
or.
Yep. And that's common in other collecting genres where the bootlegs they're rare, they're not in as much demand, and they're not
Mhm.
documented. And even though they're rare, because the demand's not there, people don't push to research it and
Right.
and unlock it and uncover it, and you don't get they don't surface as much because there isn't the demand. And it's really strange. Like in a lot of collecting genres, you don't see that interest in the bootlegs as you do in Star Wars. But
Yeah.
yes, for some reason Star Wars is really into it. But some of them do dabble in it. I've seen it, but like I dabble sometimes in like Beatles collectibles. I just like, but I
Mhm.
try to connect, with the people, and I try to learn from that, because like one of the reasons I like collecting Beatles is just because I like the band, but also it's like it's a generation that's older than me, and so it's many ways I can apply it to Star Wars because it follows like a timeline ahead of where Star Wars will probably head. And you see, like,
Yeah.
they don't really get into bootlegs. They dabble in them, but they don't really care. Then there's a lot of bootleg stuff from that, and they just don't care.
Sure.
And the stuff is exceptionally rare, but it's not really a big deal in their world. So it's interesting. Star Wars
It
is
is
unique
interesting.
in that
Like, I
way. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can't figure it out,
Yeah.
but I do feel it myself. Like, I see a lot of these bootlegs and I'm like, "Oh my god, that is so amazing." Whereas I do not feel that. I love My Little Pony, but
Yeah.
I do not feel that when I see a fakie, which
Yeah.
is what we call them. Like, they
Mhm.
just look unappealing and kinda, like, I don't
Yeah.
know what it is, but there's just something about it
Yeah.
that's amazing. Um, what I had been suspecting, and it doesn't seem like there's any evidence of this, but I had this sort of working hypothesis in my mind about, did after the first film and all of this stuff happened with the first movie that came out, and then the toys rolled out and they didn't have them ready, and there were all these bootlegs, and certainly by the time of Empire and right after Empire, Lucasfilm had to be aware that this was happening. And even though they were making toys, there were a lot of bootlegs. And so, and one of the things they could have controlled would have been doing things to like make it more difficult to do actual, like, to go against the people who were trying to sell their things off as real. So like, almost like you would with counterfeit money, right? Like, when you've got a lot of counterfeit money, you would put things in the money, the new printings, to make it more difficult to counterfeit. Like, they could make more intricate molds of their toys, or they could put more elaborate designs on the packaging that would make it harder for people to mimic. But it doesn't seem like that happened, at least in the original trilogy years. Would you agree that they didn't really seem to do a lot of that?
Yeah, I think other than, yeah, I don't think they did a lot. I mean, I think the quality of the production process is just so much better than the bootleg stuff. Like,
Yeah. Well,
that
certainly.
I don't think I think that they felt like it was pretty differentiated even. So,
Okay.
um, but yeah, they didn't like do any of the stuff like, certificates on it or holograms or any of that stuff in those days. Like
Was
the
that Power of the Force era more?
yeah,
Like,
yeah, I think more like you get yeah, you get more to like the 90s and so on where you start to see uh, people try to make it more explicit that this is officially licensed product.
mhm,
But I think in general, like the manufacturing process, by and large, for most of the ones we covered, it's sort of night and day the quality control on it. Other than some of the lightsabers and things that were made, but those were pretty well made. But the most of the action figure toys were just you could tell like when you hold them, a lot of them are brittle.
yeah,
One thing we didn't talk about is like a lot of those carded figures, the Polish figures, the Hungarian figures, the Turkish figures, the bubbles slide off the cards. I mean, they are really cheaply made. Like many of those Turkish figures, the bubbles aren't even attached really that well to the card. They come loose, so you can tell as opposed to like Kenner, which has that it's like sealed onto that card
right,
really solidly.
right.
So just even the packaging and so on, you can see the quality difference. I think that was the main thing that they really differentiate on quality. Um, but um, but yeah, that's the biggest thing. It's really only the lightsabers where I'd say the quality flipped and the bootlegs were better. Uh,
Yeah, for sure. Well, I know you only have a few more minutes, so I wanted
yeah,
to really quickly run through
yeah,
just some of these great images that Trevor
yeah.
sent me, because some of them I
Oh
don't
yeah,
know.
that
Obviously, some of those are his Gamorrean guards that he
that's
has.
awesome.
I'm not sure. Is it the same on the left? It's just more of his collection of these. Are these the Uzi? Or no, these
No,
are
no, they
the
wouldn't be Uze.
no, they're
They look like they might be a mix of lines there.
they're cool. I mean,
Yeah, I think
seeing them all in mass like that is
yeah,
just really
yeah,
impressive.
I would guess like Brazilian and Polish figures, but hard to tell from the photo.
Yeah,
But
from that
but
distance, yeah,
but yeah,
and
yeah,
then just that again, Chewbacca always looks like nightmare fuel in some of these,
yeah,
and it's that the Luke is fairly unfortunate.
yeah.
What's bondage, Luke? I
Yeah, I
don't.
know what is up with that. Yeah,
I don't know. I assume it's him. It's supposed to be him hanging upside down in the cave. Is that what it is?
yeah, that's probably what that is, I
But that's not
guess.
his
Yeah,
costume he was wearing
yeah, I don't know.
color-wise, but it's maybe it's just a little alternate fanfic story version of
Yeah,
um, and then some of
oh,
these,
these
I
are
don't
great.
even
Yeah.
know
Yeah,
are
these
these
they used to have these I've seen. I used to see these a lot. These were like they used to have like carnival prizes and things where they had these mirrors with an image.
right.
These were bootleg like crazy in the 70s and 80s. Used to see these all the time. And like head shops would have these all
Yeah, I
like
do remember this, yeah.
yeah, that kind of thing.
Especially the middle one with the mirror on the back. People
Yeah,
guys would
yeah,
have these in their bedrooms all the time.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I
Those
think
are
it's
great.
funny that we've got, like, Space Attack, which I guess is sort of like are these all, like are those Atari game? Like, what are
Yeah,
those?
yeah.
Or
That's
n
like
are they, like, computer games? I
yeah.
can't even
Those
tell.
are it's like yeah. Those are like I don't know which system
System
it
they
is,
are, but
but it's they're cartridges to a video game, and yeah, it's just yeah, you can see all the stuff is very very derivative of Star Wars. Like
for
just
sure, for
yeah
sure. I
yeah
love this is that
yeah
I assume it's a belt buckle, it
belt
may be a
buckle yeah,
tray.
and then the watch display yeah
He
that's
looks like he's saying he's either, like, gonna punch you or he's
yeah
like, "I want you," like,
yeah no, no I
it's
want you for the
amazing,
army yeah
right?
yeah
Um, and I don't honestly know. I think I've seen on Trevor's, Facebook page, the guy on the right, the little robot guy, he almost looks like, Danger Will Robinson. What he doesn't he look like that guy a little
yeah
bit
yeah
more
yeah
than
a
R2?
little bit of yeah
Yeah.
the
Um,
Lost in Space one yeah
yeah,
Yeah,
but, I mean, a lot of stuff from that time I think, Conrad, you guys just talked about the black hole on Movie Oubliette, so that was kind of
yeah.
also, like, trying to movies were trying to sort of spin off on Star Wars as well.
And then getting too close sometimes as well, so that the influence was really noticeable. One of my favorite stories from Charles Lippincot's Facebook page is about this car dealership that he had to send a cease and desist to because they were selling cars with this R2D2 lookalike rolling around the forecourt and
That's hilarious.
having like a Star Wars day. So again, I very much got the sense that it wasn't the fans they were going after; it was companies that were just trying to,
Right.
profit from some association that they really hadn't earned.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's see. I've got one or two more little crazy things that I just kind of want people to see because they're just so cool.
Like the Russian one in the upper right, like
Mhm.
when I went first time I went to Russia was like in 1993, I think. And it was just after they, just 2 years after they sort of, opened up the country. And that book, so the you can see that where you see like Luke and Leia up on the book
Mhm.
cover and the planet there. That was a book, a hardbound book that I bought from a street vendor, and that image was used as the card back for the action figure. So those are some of the Russian action figures, but they actually just use imagery from the book to make that. And I still have the book, but yeah, these are great. Just pretty
Yeah.
obscure. Yeah.
And then yet another crazy looking Chewbacca.
Yeah, there are a lot of plaster bootlegs, and we didn't even really talk about that, but
Yeah.
some of them would cast off like the California original stuff, or the cookie jars, and then some of them made their own. There's like a sort of famous like Darth Vader thing, that's like a lamp thing. There are a bunch of bootleg ceramic things that were also very popular
Right.
at the time.
Mhm.
One of the interesting things that also leave you with is, the bootleg stuff in Star Wars is so popular
Mhm.
that it's even influenced officially released products. So like
Hmm.
years later, Kubrick Tomy actually made a Blue Stars figure. They actually made a Kubrick Snowtrooper Blue Stars version, which is hilarious. They actually took the Turkish bootleg figure and made an official release Kubrick figure out of it, which
And
is like tells you
Wow.
how legendary like Blue Stars has become from the Turkish line.
I can see that being like some sort of Comic-Con exclusive type of thing
Yeah,
as well. Like
yeah,
them
Yeah.
doing like some, officially licensed but homage to like some vintage popular thing. That's slightly
yeah.
different, but just I can totally see that.
The other one along that lines that's awesome is, if you're familiar with it, there's a whole like sort of genre of custom action figure creators who do creative and so artistic kind of, and like if you're familiar with DK Toys, the Dove Kellermer's company that works with artists to do these custom toys, of really limited run toys. And there's one artist that goes by the name Buzzard Guts that has been doing
Sounds familiar,
yeah, they've
actually.
been
Yeah.
doing Star World action figures. So that Star World case you showed earlier, they've actually been
Mhm.
making carded action figures of those characters.
Wow.
And they haven't
I
gone through the
love
whole.
it.
They've done like 5 of them, I think, so far, and there's like 8 different ones on that Star World case. So I've been buying them because I'm just like, I got to get the whole Star World action figure set, because they're just so they've actually been, and, they do them in limited runs of like 25 of each figure, but it sort of tells you like some of these bootlegs are such classics that even artists are making like parodies of them in
Sure.
contemporary things.
Yeah. They've become iconic in their own right. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
Now I want all the model trim.
yeah. They are awesome. The model train.
I love them, but
Yeah,
don't,
yeah,
put them in your
yeah,
mouth.
yeah, yeah.
All
Poisonous,
right.
but
Well,
exciting.
I know that you have a hard stop, and
Yep.
so I want to make sure I respect your time. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank all of
Yeah.
you for joining us as well. And I will. I don't know, Conrad. Do we have? We don't have a custom closer. Let me just pull up the thing. Okay, so now I can go to our end title. Thank you so much, Gus, and thanks to everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Bye.
Bye.